Shalom and welcome back to Israel with Aline. We are now in front of Mount Sodom, one of the most terrible places in biblical history. Here we see a mountain made entirely of salt and covered with a thin layer of sand and soil. And we can see this very well through this rock, which was part of the mountain, and it fell and stopped here. And we can clearly see that it is made of salt. And besides that, up here there's a salt statue with a shape that resembles a woman. You can see it right up here. And she is known by the locals as Lot's wife. But is this really the sinful city that was destroyed by God with fire, salt, and sulfur? Today you will discover the story of Sodom like you've never seen before, because now we are going to release this full lesson for the first time to the entire public. Today we are going to focus on the plain of the Jordan, in Hebrew, Kikar Ayarden. And in this region there were 5 main cities: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, which is also often called Zoar. And they were located near the Dead Sea. And although today we associate this region with a lifeless dead place, back in the Bronze Age, in the time of Abraham, it was a region full of life. Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. Like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as far as the region of Zoar. This was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. And we have historical records of the existence of these cities. In 1975, a large archive with 1,757 clay tablets dated around the year 2400 before Christ were discovered in Tel Mardik, which is ancient Ebla located in northern Syria. And one of these tablets is a geographic atlas, which lists 289 place names. And an analysis done by the archaeologist William Shea found that part of this list corresponds to the area of the Dead Sea Plain. And there are 2 places named, number 210, Admah, and number 211, Sodom. But what else do we know about the 5 cities of the plain? We know that they were Canaanite city-states, small to medium in size, with populations probably in the hundreds or a few thousand inhabitants. The economy was diverse. They had farmers, shepherds, as well as merchants. There are saints, etans, and artisans, futuros leanos, ruberti, and trade mainly used the trade routes that passed through there. And as Canaanites, they were polytheists, and they worshipped the local pantheon. And although they weren't very large, the cities had alliances among themselves for mutual protection and also economic benefit, as suggested by the coalition of the 5 kings in Genesis 14. Let's see. Do you remember? When the War of the 9 Kings happens, 5 of the kings are actually from the plain of the Jordan, and they join forces to fight a common enemy. But despite their apparent material prosperity, the Bible tells us that they were wicked cities in the eyes of God. That's right, even before Lot moved there. Now the inhabitants of Sodom were evil and great sinners against the Lord. But what was really the sin or the sins of these cities? According to the Bible, many associate Sodom with sodomy and try to simplify the reason. But if we read the Bible carefully, we see that the truth is much more complex than that. It wasn't a specific mistake nor just one sin that caused the cities to be condemned. There were many moral, ethical, and behavioral problems in those cities. Let's start with the Bible reading so we can analyze it well. The two angels arrived in Sodom at dusk, and Lot was sitting at the city gate when he saw them. He got up and went to greet them. He had not yet gone to bed when all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called out to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to your house tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may have relations with them." Lot went outside, closed the door behind him, and said to them, "No, my friends, don't do this wicked thing. Look, I have two daughters who are still virgins. I'll bring them out to you, and you can do with them whatever you want. But don't do anything to these men, because they are under the protection of my roof." "Get out of the way," they shouted and said. "This man came here as a foreigner, and now he wants to be a judge? We'll do worse to you than to them." Then they pushed Lot violently and moved forward to break down the door. At that moment, the two visitors grabbed Lot, pulled him inside, and shut the door. Then they struck the men who were at the door of the house with blindness, from the youngest to the oldest, so that they couldn't find the door. The two men asked Lot, "Do you have anyone else in the city? Sons-in-law, sons or daughters, or any other relatives? Get them out of here, because we're about to destroy this place." The accusations made to the Lord against these people are so many that he sent us to destroy the city. Here are two important points. Many men, all the men of the city from all parts, came to attack the visitors. They didn't know they were angels. This shows that it wasn't just a few people doing something wrong. This shows that it was a systemic problem. It's written. The accusations are so many that he sent us to destroy the city. This shows once again that there were several kinds of sins. The first one we see here, and the one most often mentioned against Sodom especially, is sexual violence. This is also written in the New Testament, in the book of Jude, which says that Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities gave themselves up to immorality and unnatural sexual relations. But besides that, the Bible also tells us that they were proud, arrogant, and did not help those in need. "Behold, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were proud, had plenty of bread and prosperous tranquility, but never helped the poor and the needy. They were arrogant and committed abominations before me. When I saw this, I removed them from that place." And we have more information through Apocryphal and Deuterocanonical books. You will see several times throughout our classes us using these terms, Apocryphal and Deuterocanonical. But what are these books really? When we use the term biblical apocryphal books, we are referring to a collection of ancient texts written by Jewish or Christian communities. But these texts were not recognized as divinely inspired, and for that reason, they were not included in the Bible. But even when we use the term Bible, it's a bit of a complex term because the Bible is not the same for everyone. For example, if we go to a synagogue and open the Bible, in this case, the Hebrew Bible, we'll see that inside the Hebrew Bible, there are only the texts of the Old Testament. In comparison, if we go to a Catholic church and open the Bible, we'll have the Old Testament and the New Testament, but also books that are not in the Hebrew Bible and books that are not in most Protestant and Evangelical Bibles. Look how interesting. I'm going to put a table here on the screen for you that shows which books are included in each of these Bibles. And that's where the term deuterocanonical comes in. The deuterocanonical books are books that are included in some Bibles, but not in all of them. For example, the first and second book of Maccabees, they are included in the Catholic Bible and in most Bibles of the Eastern and Orthodox churches, but not in the Hebrew Bible or the Protestant Bible. Now, another example, if we talk about the third book of Maccabees, this one is also not in the Catholic Bible, but it is in the Eastern and Orthodox Bibles. And here, with just these few examples, we can see that this whole subject is really quite complex. And that's why when we talk about deuterocanonical books that are included in some Bibles but not in others, or if we talk about apocryphal books that are not included in any Bible, we have to analyze each book separately and check its historical and theological accuracy and understand how best to study them. But although most of these texts are not considered inspired scripture, these books provide us with extremely valuable historical and cultural context. And that way, we can better understand the period in which they were written. And often they give us details that aren't included in other sources. And that's why we're going to use them here in our course, but always being careful and highlighting what kind of books they are. And speaking of deuterocanonical books, the third book of Maccabees includes in the list the sins of Sodom. Besides their arrogance, their vices, you consumed with fire and brimstone the men of Sodom who acted with arrogance and were notorious for their vices and made them an example for those who would come after. This is written in the third book of Maccabees, and the text is not specific. What kind of vice did they have? But it goes into a long list of the city's sins: arrogance, vices, immorality, unnatural sexual relations, pride, not helping those in need, injustice, lack of hospitality, and much more. And all of this caused the condemnation of these cities, which God destroyed with fire and brimstone. Then the Lord himself, rained down fire and brimstone from heaven on Sodom and Gomorrah. Thus, he destroyed those cities and all the plain with all the inhabitants of the cities and the vegetation, and so the cities of the plain were destroyed. But not all of them. Zoar is spared because of Lot. Lot begs the angels to let him flee to Zoar instead of the mountains, arguing that it is a small city and could be spared. And the angels agree, and Zoar is then saved. But now let's move on to the most important part of our lesson. What does archaeology have to tell us about this destruction? The destroyed cities and Zoar have been found. Let's talk about each of the 5 cities separately. Let's start with Zoar, precisely the city that was not destroyed and therefore the easiest to find among them. Experts believe that Gorer Saf, a place that is now part of Jordan, is actually the biblical Zoar. The excavation, led by archaeologist Dr. Konstantinos Politis, found evidence of a city from the Bronze Age at the site. And more than that, it was a substantial settlement from the early Bronze Age. But in the Middle Bronze Age, the buildings are much more limited and the city grows again later in the Iron Age. This proves that in Lot's time, this place was a small city, just as described in the Bible. And another indication that this place is Zoar is the Madaba map. This is a giant mosaic from the 6th century, which includes a map of the Promised Land. The Madaba map is the oldest known geographic mosaic in the history of art, and it is widely used for locating and verifying biblical places. And this map shows that Zoar is where Gur es-Safi is today. Furthermore, the Bible tells us that not long after the destruction of the cities, Lot and his daughters began living in a cave near Zoar. And a cave was found exactly 7 kilometers from Gur es-Safi. And in front of it, the remains of an ancient Christian church called the Sanctuary of Saint Lot. This church was built in the 5th century, and this shows that the Christians of the region, at least for 1600 years, have recognized this cave as the place where Lot and his daughters hid, and that it is the cave next to Zoar. And this church is also marked on the Madaba map. Another indication of the location of Zoar is precisely the mention made in the book of Isaiah 15:5, and in it there is a connection between Zoar and Moab. And this is consistent with the location near the lower eastern plain of the Dead Sea, which nowadays is in Jordan. And this is precisely the region of Gur es-Safi. And the real cherry on top of the archaeological cake is the cemetery that was found next to Gur es-Safi. Approximately 300 tombstones were found there, many of them with inscriptions. And these tombstones belong to both Jews and Christians, and most of them are dated around the 5th century AD. But in a special inscription, there is a description that the deceased who was buried there was brought from Zafar. Zafar is the capital of the ancient kingdom of Himyar, to be buried in Zoar. Exactly, they already said we brought him here to Zoar, just for the record. Himyar is nowadays what is part of Yemen. So really this person wanted to be buried in Zoar, and his body made a really long journey. In conclusion, due to everything we've talked about, we conclude that Gur es-Safi was Zoar, also called Bela. And now we still need to find the 4 cities that were destroyed by God. And that's a much bigger challenge. And it's a question that has really intrigued Bible scholars and archaeologists. For many centuries, and especially in the last 150 years, many theories have been presented about the possible location of Sodom, Gomorrah, and the other destroyed cities. Some of these theories are actually serious and important, and some theories have already been partially or completely refuted. And now we are going to talk about each of these theories together and really try to understand where it is. Sodom, Gomorrah, Zeboim, and Admah. Barbedara was considered as possibly the place of Sodom. And it makes a lot of sense, because when the archaeologists arrived at this place, what they found was an early Bronze Age city that was destroyed by a great fire. Listen carefully, this city is from the early Bronze Age. It was destroyed around the year 2350 before Christ, centuries before the birth of Abraham and Lot. And even though this city, this place they found, yes, had a terrible end, it can't be Sodom, precisely because of its dating. Another place that experts have considered to be Gomorrah is present-day Numira, and in the archaeological excavations, an early Bronze Age city was revealed, which had an even more violent and devastating end than Barbedara. However, we are once again talking about the early Bronze Age. Numeira is even older. It is believed that it was destroyed between the year 2600 before Christ and around the year 2400 before Christ, and for this reason, once again, the dating does not match the period of the patriarchs. Another problem with this theory is that the population fled the city. We know that they fled in a hurry, but this does not fit the biblical narrative. What was found in the archaeological excavations are proofs that some houses in the city were blocked off. I mean, people left their houses and they blocked the doors. Maybe to reinforce the house, maybe because of something they knew was going to happen, maybe to prevent looting. Also, when they excavated, they didn't find small valuable objects. They didn't find food, but they did find a lot of pottery and large worthless things. All of this indicates to us that the people knew they needed to flee the city in a hurry. They took everything of value they could carry. They took the food they needed for the journey and everything else they left behind. But they locked their houses, hoping that maybe they could return to their homes later. But as archaeology shows, something violently destroyed the city and the population never returned. However, once again, the dating does not match the biblical description, not in the same period, and also when we read the story of Sodom, Gomorrah, and the destroyed cities. It was a sudden attack. The population didn't know things were going to happen. People stayed in their homes, so there were no survivors from the cities, except for Lot and his family. So because of that, Numeira is probably not a good candidate to be Gomorrah. Archaeologists also found two sites, one called Feifa and the other Kirbet el-Kanazir. But these two places were quickly ruled out as possibilities because they weren't even cities during the Bronze Age. We've already talked about where Sodom and Gomorrah are not. But now let's talk about the two main theories that could actually be correct. And the first is Tel el-Hammam, which is in the north of the Dead Sea, on the Jordanian side. There they found remains of a city from the Chalcolithic period, which continued into the early and middle Bronze Age. There are also remains from the Iron Age, as well as the Roman and Hellenistic periods. And the city reached its peak, its greatest extent, during the Middle Bronze Age. And then it had approximately 8,000 inhabitants, fortifications, significant, and even a palace. And we remember that in the description, in the biblical description, Lot meets the angels when he was sitting by the city gate. Since 2005, the excavations at the site have been led by Stephen Collins from Trinity Southwest University. He found concrete evidence of the city's destruction. There is an entire layer of ashes that shows the violent end of the site. Vitrified stones were found. This is a phenomenon that happens at a heat above 2000 degrees. Melted stones were also found which returned to a lava state. And that doesn't happen in a normal fire. And the scientists also noticed that the city was burned from top to bottom. I want you to hear the words of Stephen Collins himself. This site marks one of the most violent and enormous destruction events imaginable. We have pieces of pottery melted into glass, some bubbled like lava. Foundation stones and burnt bricks turned red or looked like pottery due to extremely high temperatures. Most of the superstructures made of mud bricks from the Middle Bronze II period were apparently torn from their foundations. It's a scene of extreme devastation and disintegration. We even documented pieces of desert glass scattered across the eastern Kikar, created at temperatures that exceed 6,000 degrees Celsius. But how can we explain this colossal destruction? The theory is that it was caused by the explosion of a meteorite. Maybe something similar to the Tunguska event, which was the fall and explosion of a meteorite in Tunguska, Siberia on June 30, 1908, which devastated an area of thousands of square kilometers. That's because the meteorite didn't actually hit the Earth, since it exploded at an altitude of 5 to 10 kilometers in the atmosphere. In this case, in Siberia, it's estimated that the explosion had an energy between 10 and 15 megatons. Just for comparison, that's 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. And the theory is that el-Hammam was destroyed in a way similar to a meteor explosion. And this also fits with the archaeological findings, the way the city was destroyed from top to bottom, with fire and heat that can't be created in almost any other way. And it also fits with the biblical description of fire literally raining from the sky. This also explains the abandonment of the city for centuries, because an explosion of this kind would make the place infertile and uninhabitable. So, this place we see on the screen, Tel el-Hammam, is one of the 4 cities punished by God. We see that archaeology is really quite interesting, and this is a real possibility. But there's a catch. Tel el-Hammam, after its great destruction, was abandoned for centuries. But in the Iron Age, the city was indeed rebuilt. It existed during the Iron Age, Roman period, and Byzantine period, which surprises us because the Bible directly and indirectly says that Sodom and Gomorrah were not re-inhabited. Like in the examples of these verses that are on the screen now, if you want, you can pause to read them carefully. And another source we have is Flavius Josephus, a historian who lived in the 1st century after Christ, and he writes the following in the book, Antiquities of the Jews. As for Lot, he chose the plains along the Jordan River near the city of Sodom, which was then flourishing but is now completely destroyed by God's vengeance. And nothing remains of it, not even the slightest trace. He says that there are not even traces of the city of Sodom. And at that time, in the time of Flavius Josephus, not only were there traces of the city, but there are still traces to this day. But at that time, the city of Tel el-Hammam was indeed inhabited. So this also raises doubts about whether we are really talking about the right place. In short, Tel el-Hammam is a strong candidate to be one of the 4 destroyed cities, but it doesn't necessarily have to be Sodom. We still need to look for answers about how and why the city was rebuilt in later periods. And the last possible theory about the location of Sodom is precisely Mount Sodom. Hasdom in Hebrew. This is one of the most accepted theories in Israel nowadays. It is located in the southwestern part of the Dead Sea, right on the Israeli side, and it is a place like no other in the world. We are talking about a mountain that is 8 kilometers long, 5 kilometers wide, 220 meters high, but almost entirely made of salt. And what is the connection between this mountain and Sodom? First of all, the name, but of course we know that the local population, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, have called this place Mount Sodom for centuries. But that's not enough, because we know that names can change throughout history. Another clue is precisely its composition. It is made up of approximately 90% salt, and unlike the other mountains around it, which are made of limestone, And the formation of salt fits well with the biblical account. You see, the whole land burned with sulfur and salt, so that it will not be sown, nothing will grow, nor will any grass grow on it. Just like the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, which the Lord destroyed in the anger of his wrath. We see that the account says the land was scorched with salt and sulfur, and we know that the mountain is made of salt. But besides that, thousands of sulfur balls were found around it. And they have an abnormally high purity, reaching up to 98% sulfur. And they burn at extremely high temperatures with blue-colored flames. And what we're seeing on the screen right now is exactly one of those sulfur balls that I picked up myself in this area and later burned somewhere else. And we know that covering a place with salt was a method used in biblical times to prevent the reconstruction of a city. Abimelech fought against the city all that day, took the city and killed the people who were in it, destroyed the city, and scattered salt over it. Abimelech lived centuries after Abraham and Lot. But we can see that this was a technique known by the people of this region to prevent the reconstruction of a city. So it makes sense that the city was covered or somehow turned into salt. Another interesting clue comes precisely from Strabo, who was a historian and geographer who lived about 2,000 years ago. And he identifies Mount Sodom as the location of the biblical Sodom, and he specifically mentions its proximity to Masada. So can we now be certain and say that Mount Sodom is really the biblical Sodom? Not yet. There is also a problem or a doubt regarding this theory. There is no definitive evidence of a city at the site. The mountain is made entirely of salt, which makes research very difficult. So if the city of Sodom was really here, it was destroyed in such a way that nothing was left for analysis. In conclusion, many theories have been raised about where the 5 cities of the plain might have been. Gores Safi is really the best candidate for Zoar, and everything really points to that place. About Sodom, Gomorrah, Zeboim, and Admah, there are still discussions, but the 2 most likely theories are exactly Tel el-Hammam and Mount Sodom. In my opinion, yes, there is even a possibility that both theories are correct because there were 4 cities and we have 2 possible locations. However, this subject really still needs more studies and more archaeological research. But what we can learn from this story is not to make the same mistakes as people did in the past. We should avoid being arrogant, proud, unjust, and forgetting about the needy, the foreigners, and those who need us the most. Truly, these lessons are just as valid back then as they are today. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson. A big hug to everyone, and I'll see you next time.